Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. The Gray Ranch along 3rd Avenue in the sleepy Midwestern town of less than 400 people was the recurring site of screaming, mad chaos, and horrific domestic violence. Then one day, abusive husband Scott Shanahan was gone. Some thought he packed his bags and left town. Weeks passed, months went by, still no sign of the volatile wife-beater. But what really happened to him was so shocking and so unbelievable that even grizzled, long-time law enforcement officials were aghast by the sight and awful smell. The town wondered why Dixie Shanahan managed to live with her husband's rotting body inside her master bedroom for 14 months. This fascinating story will leave you asking yourself one question. Was the punishment that Dixie received in her case justified? The book that we're profiling this evening is Dixie's Last Stand. Was it murder or self-defense? With my special guest, journalist and author, John Ferak. Welcome back to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview, John Ferak.
Dan, thanks very much for having me back on. I'm very thankful.
Thank you very much. We had a great time last time speaking with you. So let's jump right into this. Tell us how you came to be interested in this story and why you decided to write this book, Dixie's Last Stand. What was it about this case that compelled you to write this book?
Well, one of the things that was kind of interesting too, Dan, just from a timeliness standpoint, I think this was probably my second or third day. I was a newspaper journalist in Omaha, Nebraska. Wound up being out there for about 9 years, but it was actually, I think, my second or third day on the job, and a brief story came over the Associated Press wire back at the downtown office, and it was just real short, and it announced that a woman in Defiance, Iowa, had been arrested for murder, and but it also pointed out that that her husband had apparently been left in the house for more than a year, which was just unbelievable. So that day, myself and a seasoned veteran, a photographer by the name of Rudy Smith, who had been at the Omaha newspaper for 40 years, we loaded up the photography gear and got our notebooks and made the hour-long drive out to Defiance, Iowa. And it just really was an unusual murder case to be covering. I really couldn't recall at that point in time, really covering an odd murder case such as this in a town of less than 400 people, in a county of about 13,000 people, and it just really was unbelievable. And the first thing that kind of jumped in my mind, and a lot of other people, was how could this have been hidden for over a year? How was Scott Shanahan's body hidden from the public? Just how come nobody knew about this? And right. We'll get into this, I'm sure, in the show. But eventually, a lot of the peculiarities of the case, but then also other aspects of domestic violence and issues about fair and righteous sentencings, and actually kind of a forgotten point, but one I really focused in on, really drove me to kind of write the book as well, Dan, was along the lines of, I thought this was a very well done small town sheriff's investigation. This was an agency that only had I think 7 or 8 full-time deputies plus the sheriff. And in this case, the sheriff actually did his own investigations and played a key role and getting to the bottom of things. So kind of all those things came together, and that's what was going to ultimately lead me to write a book on this that came out earlier this year, Dan.
Now tell us, basically, I'd like to get, for people that don't live in this area, I'm not familiar with it and might not even be familiar with the United States so much, but let's get the geographical position in terms of, there's Des Moines, which is a place more well-known, and you said like this is less than 400 people, but this is about 60 miles outside of Omaha. So give us basically the cities that are bigger that we might note, and tell us where this place is, and then tell us a little bit more about Harlan, Iowa. So where basically the closest biggest town in this county.
Correct.
So tell us about that.
Correct. Yeah, for people again throughout North America, United States, and Canada, like Dan had mentioned, the two most populated cities, one is Omaha, Nebraska, which is about an hour to the west of Defiance, Iowa, and Des Moines, which would probably be about 2 hours to the east of Defiance, Iowa. And again, Defiance is a little town of about 400 people in a county, Shelby County, Iowa, which had about 13,000 people. And this is a very agriculturally dominated area and region of Iowa. So a lot of people throughout this region either work in agriculture, work in farming, or have some type of job that's connected, to the agriculture economy, while others may work in government sector jobs, such as working for the county government, the county courthouse, or a school teacher, or law enforcement jobs and stuff like that. This is an area of the country that really, or at least this area here, Shelby County, and in particular Defiance, we're really trying to maintain status quo. There really weren't too many new job opportunities, let alone any companies opening up. So Defiance in particular had a downtown that really didn't have very much aside from the volunteer fire station, a small bank, and a village hall and a clerk's office, and one restaurant / bar that was kind of tucked in the community. While Harlan, as you mentioned, Dan, was the county seat, and Harlan was it still is a very viable, strong, small town community. Has excellent schools, really good sports programs, and really is the economic hub of Shelby County, a town of about 5,000 or 6,000, with a handful of key, I think, manufacturing companies and major employers. So really a lot of people throughout the Shelby County area, particularly Defiance, would often make the 12 or 13 mile drive either into Harlan, Iowa, or also up Highway 59 toward Denison, Iowa, which was about, again, another 8 or 9 miles up the road. But really, Harlan was the economic base of the county, and Harlan is actually where the sheriff's office and the city of Harlan Police Department were located, and that's where all the county government offices, including the courthouse and the jail, were located.
Now let's talk about Scott Shanahan. He was born in 1962. Not really a big guy, but tell us a little bit about as much as you found out about his early life, and tell us what happens according to Harlan Police later, Deputy John Kelly. But let's start off with his earliest background, and if it's some kind of indication of what later he becomes.
Right. Well, I'm going off of memory here, and Scott was short, 5'4", tough kid, tough guy, and was an only child, and his parents had moved when he was really little from I believe Denison. Yeah, he was born in Denison, and then they moved just right down the road, and in the early 1980s had built a house in the town of Defiance, Iowa. And it's a nice piece of property. It's a ranch. It's got a nice big backyard, really nice mature trees now. And like I said, it's a nice house. And this is where he grew up. Lived there with his mom and dad. And really. Just kind of putzed around as he grew up. Really didn't, wasn't very motivated either for career or education, and really took a liking to automobiles, but really didn't pursue that as a career. And he had worked a handful of different jobs over the years, but oftentimes got fired from these jobs, usually related to not showing up for work. So he was not really dependable, and he also wasn't very motivated, to make something of himself, more or less. But his family had, they came into a garage property that was right across the street, Dan, and it's really this garage where he spent the bulk of his time restoring and acquiring older vehicles, a lot of classic cars, and this is kind of where he would just putz around most of his days, and just really refurbish these cars, cut them down a little bit, but spend a lot of his time there, and as his future wife is going to eventually talk about and testify, this really wasn't a job or anything where he was making a lot of money. It just really was more or less, his hobby. And that really didn't help out, as far as generating income, once he eventually does get married and have children.
Now, what was the earliest record in terms of alcohol and or drug problems, before we talk about just his relationships with women in general, how he was and how he was received by women?
I know he had a couple minor skirmishes with the law enforcement. I believe in his, born in 62, in his 20s, but nothing that really landed him in any serious hot water with authorities. There were different reports, like I said, just minor drug use, marijuana, but this is not really hardcore distribution or dealing. I think by and large, like I said, he came in contact, he interacted with a lot of the local law enforcement officials, and again, in a small town, small county, such as Shelby County, wasn't uncommon for the cops to know the locals and vice versa, even if they weren't causing trouble. But the problems, by and large, that that he was involved with, prior to his marriage with Dixie, really were pretty minor, and again, didn't amount to any significant crime that would have ever put him in jail, let alone prison. Dan.
Now let's talk about Dixie Schreiber. She was born in 1967 in Muscatine, Iowa, and her parents are Richard and Darlene, and she's got two brothers and two sisters, or part of two brothers and two sisters. And her father dies when she's 3, and then a stepfather comes into the scene, and he's sexually abusive. So tell us a little bit more about this chaotic family situation that Dixie grew up in.
Yeah, this was actually one of the family that she came from, is well known nowadays. Unfortunately, more infamous for its dysfunction, and there was a lot of reports, over the years after, even after Dixie had gotten away from this family, Dan, but just all kinds of unfortunate reports of incest and and sexual abuse by stepfather toward his toward his stepdaughters and stuff, and as Dixie later testified, she testified that she had been a victim as well as her siblings, but it's a rough situation, and it's an unfortunate situation, and people certainly understood and felt sorry for her, and as a teenager, around 15 or 16, she's going to come to live with Scott Shanahan and his parents, Beverly and Al, and it's around that point in time where I think Dixie was 15 or 16. Scott's about 5 years older. That's where they started dating and became a serious item. Again, at the same point that they're, living under the same roof. But it's really, at this house on 3rd Street or 3rd Avenue in Defiance is where Dixie's going to move in, during the 1980s, and it's really where she's going to spend the next 20 years or so, of her life. But like you said, she came from a tough family.
Now, let's talk about the age that there's an age difference, and so it's important at this young age. So she's 16, Scott is 21 at this time.
Correct. And he also, he possesses a very domineering, overbearing personality, but it sounds like that wasn't immediately apparent, or at least at first to Dixie. It may have involved yelling and screaming, kind of more of a domineering personality, but it wasn't any type of serious violence at first. That eventually perpetuates and becomes a huge issue and a huge factor in the events that unfold over a matter of time. But at first, like we pointed out, about a 5 or 6 year age difference between the two of them. But they got along. They yell at each other, but were willing to put up with each other. And I think, Dan, the fact that Dixie was so young, 15 or 16, she really, especially in a real small, isolated town like this too, I think she really wasn't exposed, to other guys, other potential suitors, or just having an opportunity to even see what else is out there. That's kind of my take from studying the case over the years. But it just seems like those two start a serious romance, serious relationship with each other while they're very young. Well, she's very young and he's a little bit older, and that's really all Dixie is exposed to, and she really just falls head over heels for Scott Shanahan, and unfortunately, it's going to lead to a downward spiral, over a period of time.
What we didn't mention, and I think is important too, to sort of understand the character of Dixie, and that is that in 1984 she finally broke away from this sexual abuse that was rampant in her family, this continual sexual abuse. So she broke away in 1984, but you talk about how she did that. She said she threatened her father that she was going to go to police, and then the father took off with one of his female companions. So you could see that the father dying at 3, she finally breaking away, but in that she had to actually threatened to call police, and then her father, the solution was to take off with his newest girlfriend.
Thanks for
this is beyond dysfunction.
Right, and I remember, I think they were living right across the state line, again, close to Omaha, in the small community of Utan, Nebraska, which was a small town of about 1,100 people just west of Omaha, Nebraska. And I remember it either comes out in the trial or in court testimony a later date too, but I think Dixie had pointed out that the family was constantly on the move when she was young, and her belief was that was often because it was harder for the police to, especially the smaller community police, to keep tabs on her family, especially her abusive stepfather, and more or less they were always kind of, the family or the stepfather always kept one step ahead of the police and the investigators, and especially at that day and age and that time frame, it was a lot harder for police to make a case and investigate a case. If by the time they're going out to the house, no sooner do they find out that the family had moved 60 miles away, and that seemed to be kind of the events that were unfolding when Dixie was very young. Her stepfather, had the family moving around a lot. Dixie, as she got older, just was fed up with the abuse and kind of put her foot down and, eventually got out of that house, got away from that environment. But the unfortunate end result is that that's going to lead to, bad decisions and, and bad events for her over the course of her adult life, Dan.
Now let's talk about the environment that she's living in for this 20 years, and the parents are Al Fesser and Bev, and he's got diabetes, and so he's got 2 legs amputated, and he's legally blind, and she's had a heart attack, triple bypass, and she's on an oxygen tank. So tell us about the beginning of this relationship in terms of what Dixie sees in the relationship, and tell us how it proceeds, and before we talk about the descent into something a lot different than when it started with. So tell us what it started off with and what was his relationship with all the people in the home, including Dixie.
Well, with Dixie's situation, back then, she got along real well with Al and Bev, especially Bev. And and part of living in this environment too, in this house, again, the 4 of them, Al, Bev, and their child, Scott. But Dixie took it upon herself to really also help care for Bev and Al. And as you pointed out for listeners, both of them, especially Al, really had some serious health issues. And so you have Dixie kind of taken it upon herself to, really be the caregiver to help both of them out. Whereas Scott is just kind of absent, or really that's not something that, he really took it upon himself. Dixie would go, and help buy groceries, and help run errands, especially since Al couldn't really get out of the house very much and stuff. And, Al's eventually, going to pass away, and there's going to be a conversation at a later point in time, that Dixie's going to really remember as she gets older, and it's a conversation with Bev, along the lines of if something ever happens to me, I really want you to look after Scott. There was also signs too, though, Dan, and it's important to bring this up too for listeners, where, Dixie, had also observed situations where Scott had been abusive toward his own mother, and Bev was very embarrassed and ashamed about this, to the point where I know there was an instant where where she told somebody, and I'm going off of memory, so I can't remember if it was Dixie or if it was actually one of the neighbors. But I think it may have been one of the neighbors. But Bev had told one of the neighbors that she had fallen off a ladder, while she was doing work on the house. When in reality, Scott had most likely punched his mother, gotten angry with her in a fit of rage. So there were signs of Scott being abusive toward his own mother, being physically violent toward her when he didn't get his way or wanted something. And again, in this environment, Dixie was more or less a caregiver, for Al and Bev, and really they weren't in the best of health. And it's around the early 1990s, I think 1994, if memory serves, where Bev passes away, and now, both of Scott's parents, are gone, and it's really just him and Dixie with that house.
Now, you talked about his career, and that really he didn't have much of one, and wasn't inclined for steady work, so he tinkered at the garage that was conveniently across the street. And so tell us about how they supported themselves, with what income? Where did this income come from?
Well, they were very fortunate that, especially in those days, and based on the economy at that point in time. But when Scott's parents had passed away, Scott had inherited, it was at least $150,000 plus the property. And again, it's a very nice ranch right in the community of Defiance, and also that garage. And within a couple of years, the economy was very strong. This mutual fund or stock fund, I can't remember off the top of my head what it was, but anyway, this inheritance grew very quickly too, from 150,000 to upwards of 180,000 within a couple of years. And Dixie was also working around this time frame. In fact, Scott had more or less ordered her to work, and she was a very good employee. She actually worked for a handful of different assisted living homes or independent living, but senior care. She worked in senior care and provided care and comfort for the area elderly. And so she was working, bringing in some money from that job. But really over time, though, it's this inheritance, Dan, that the couple, primarily Scott, are really going to kind of become greedy or really just kind of make us the focus, of their spending habits and practices, from there on out. And it's really this inheritance that they're going to live off of and drain down, over a short few years. And that is certainly going to strain the tensions between the couple, I believe.
Now you get to the point where there is reports that she has said to him, listen, this is just a hobby. You're going to have to get a job. So that was part of the tension, that she had this responsibility with the children, and she wanted him to find full-time employment, and his response was what?
He just becomes very, very angry and threatening toward her, and I'm trying to remember. There's so many different violent episodes, Dan, but I just know that he screams at her, on various occasions, and eventually that's going to become very, very, very violent. But he just is adamant that that he doesn't need a job, and just is not going to go out and look for a job, and how dare you, kind of becomes, he just can't accept somebody else criticizing him, let alone suggesting that he change his ways. And there's going to be all kinds of situations where he's going to throw garden tools at her. There's really going to be some violent episodes where he forces her to take out some concrete. Actually pour some concrete sidewalk in front of the house just to ridicule her, when clearly, he would have known how to do this. He sent her to drive around to a few of the area towns to find the right concrete mix, and then he forced her to mix the concrete when she admitted she clearly didn't know what she was doing. He just stood around and and smirked, and then just mocked her and humiliated her. And there's going to be a number of other episodes, where things get much, much worse than that, where he's eventually going to take her down the basement and tie her up with the clothes hanger and leave her down the basement for a couple of days at one point in time. And like I said, it's just really, where the verbal abuse really shifts into more physical abuse, and it really becomes a lot worse for Dixie over a short period of years, Dan.
You talk in the book that is year 2000, and again, a lot of these reports are according to Dixie, because she doesn't call police. And the incident that you mentioned, where he drags her downstairs by the hair and leaves her down there tied up with a coat hanger behind her back, her hands tied.
Right.
She doesn't call police, so we're getting these reports from her. And October 6, 2000, her friend Brenda Johnson called Shelby County Police, told them of abuse. But Dixie had some plan to move to Texas. So tell us about this, because this is very important to this entire story and the trial too. What happens with this Brenda
there's
Johnson?
Well, and there has been a handful of times where, again, and I should just point this out for listeners, Dixie had several family members by this point in time, around 2000, that had moved or located in around just in the state of Texas. And one was her sister Diane, I remember, and she had gone back a couple times, again, even during this tumultuous relationship, a couple times, and I may not have even gotten into this really in depth in the book, just because, again, some of these were short trips, but Dixie did make a couple trips down to Texas to stay down there for a couple of days, and then she would come back. But on this particular episode, the one you're talking about, Dan, she had confided in her friend Brenda, that she was finally ready and willing to to get out of this relationship with Scott once and for all, and Brenda wanted to make sure that it happened. She wanted to, see through, just because she knew that, especially in a situation like this, oftentimes the abuser becomes very, very overpowering and overbearing, and the victim, in this case Dixie, it would not have been a surprise for her to wilt under pressure or make excuses or just be afraid that something bad would happen if she actually carried through. And and actually did move out, pack her bags, and left. So on this occasion, Brenda goes to the property, and she sees clearly both cars are in the driveway, Scott's and Dixie's, and she goes to the door, and nobody answers the door. And I think this was the middle of the daytime too, on a weekday, and Brenda at least had the sixth sense or intuition, whatever you want to say, to get a hold of law enforcement, in this case the Shelby County Sheriff's Office. And I know the fellow that's the current sheriff now, Mark Hervey, was one of the responders, and I interviewed him at length for this book. And so Mark arrives, and I can't remember if another deputy was there as well, but they tried their best. They tried knocking on the door. Nobody came to the door. They walk around the back, and I think Mark had the smarts to think to himself that people often have keys, sometimes on their light post or under a mat, and he and Brenda quickly found this key to the front door. They walk around to the front. Now, I want to just give a little background just for listeners, kind of what's going on inside the house. Okay, the drapes are closed. Scott's inside the house with Dixie, and I believe they're two small children at that point in time. Yeah, because 2000, they would have had two. And Scott's just furious, but he's whispering because he notices a squad car now in his front driveway. And he whispers, well, I shouldn't say whispers, but he turns to Dixie and is like, "Did you call the police?" And honestly, she didn't. So, she told him the truth, but obviously he didn't believe her. Nonetheless, he's hiding her in one of the closets, and I believe the children were either in the closet or the bedroom. You can find them as well. Eventually, Hervey and Brenda come around back to the front of the house, and announce their presence and open the door, and Scott and Dixie emerge. Scott, let her out of the closet. The two children emerge as well, and Dixie just had both eyes just were just horribly, purple, just black and blue, I should say. But she had clearly been beaten by Scott in the hours preceding this. And that day, the sheriff's office took Scott into custody, and they charged him with domestic violence. Again, now I'm going off of memory. I think if we're talking 2000, Dan, this would have been his third arrest for domestic violence, and which would have been very important because that would have been the one that led to the Class D felony, which was the most severe charge that he had faced up to this point in time related to domestic violence with Dixie. This would have been the charge that carried up to 5 years in prison, and I believe they also charged him as well, with false imprisonment or a charge, basically for holding Dixie captive as well. So there were two charges he faced. Dixie's able to get out of the situation. Obviously, Scott gets taken away in handcuffs, driven to the county jail in Harlan, 12 miles away. He's sitting there, waiting trial. Dixie does make it down to Texas then. And again, especially for listeners throughout North America, the distance from Iowa to Texas, is well over 1,000 miles. It's a very, very long distance to get there, either by car or by automobile. And that's very important to point out because that distance alone would make it very, very difficult for an abuser, even like Scott Shanahan, to just all of a sudden suddenly show up and harm Dixie, grab her and throw her in the back of his pickup truck and drive all the way back to Iowa. So that the distance could and should have been some comfort and reassurance to Dixie. And the fact that the Shelby County County Attorney's Office, in concert with the Sheriff's Office, really was going to work hard to make sure that this third arrest for domestic violence, the felony charge, really was going to stick. And if it would stick, in all likelihood, he would have gone to prison, and served at least a handful of years, if not the full 5 years. Bottom line, that's very important too, because that would have made it easy too for Dixie to get a divorce or just get out of this relationship and and move on and meet somebody, meet a nice guy, somebody she had never had an opportunity to meet because she and Scott had been together since she was 15 or 16 then, Dan.
Now the thing is, she's got this ideal opportunity to rebuild his life, the supportive family, especially with the sister 1,000 miles away from. And it looks like they're very determined to put this guy away for a fair amount of time. So what does Scott do in response to this? What does he do?
Well, that's kind of in the point where he really kind of tries to become Mr. Lovey-Dovey and really appeal to Dixie that he's going to become a changed man, and that he's really going to settle down, that he's rethought things. He's not going to be. He's going to change his old ways and bad behavior. Going off of memory, but I know he mentions things like going to counseling, batterers education classes, and and he's really going to appeal to her on an emotional standpoint. That really the most important thing for her, according to him, is really to have their family whole again, to be intact, and he's going to and also obviously you can't have a family if he's going to be in prison. So you got to remember, listeners have to remember, he's appealing to her, but in reality he's pushing her. He either subconsciously or just being outright about it, but nonetheless, he's going to appeal to her to the point where she's going to write to the court, the prosecutor's office, and inform them that she does not want to come back to the state of Iowa to testify as their key witness in order to secure a conviction against Scott Shanahan in court, this domestic violence, this felony charge that the prosecutor's office and Susan Christensen, the prosecutor, really were hoping to move forward and send Scott to prison for. The prosecutor's office isn't going to just immediately listen to Dixie. They're going to plead with her to the point where they're going to initially delay the trial, Dan, and they're also going to point out that if money's a concern, well, they're just going to point out they're willing to pay to get Dixie to come back to Iowa, pay her airfare, hotel, whatever accommodations are necessary, to help, just to make sure that she's able to be in court to appear on the witness stand, raise her right hand, and promise to tell the truth. So help her God. But she's not going to want to have any of that, and it's going to become a lost cause and a very frustrating case for the county attorney's office and the sheriff's office. And eventually, what's going to happen is, without their key witness, they're going to have to drop their criminal charges against Scott Shanahan. So, for context and background for listeners, Scott had already been convicted of 2 misdemeanor domestic violence charges prior to this third charge, where he had held his wife captive and left her with black and blue eyes. So unfortunately, the most serious crime that he commits, the most serious offense that he's arrested for, is the one that he ultimately gets away with scot-free. It never goes on his record as far as a conviction. He never does any, incarceration as far as a sentence for this crime. Yes, he had been arrested. Yes, he did, some time in jail awaiting trial, but there was no conviction for this crime and no felony on his record. So he gets released from jail, and this I think is really even more important for listeners as far as just kind of the string of bad decisions that happened involving Dixie Shanahan. Dixie's going to soon afterwards make the decision to reunite with Scott, to the point where she doesn't even tell her sister Diane, that she's going to go back to Iowa and get back together with Scott. And by doing so, she had abandoned, she was going to nursing school down in the state of Texas and pursuing a nursing degree, which really would have set her up, for a great and steady career path in Texas. She's going to drop that and return to the state of Iowa and move back to the house on Third Avenue and get back together with Scott and their 2 kids. So for Scott, he gets his wife back, who he had abused repeatedly, and he doesn't have an additional conviction on his record, and he doesn't go to prison. So he gets everything he wants. And unfortunately for Dixie, the abuse is still going to continue. It's only going to intensify, according to all accounts then, Dan, from that point forward.
What happens in terms of the relationship that's very, very important, according to her and according to anybody, in terms of addition to the family?
Well, let's see. There's going to be a situation where, let's see, we're talking 2002, where Dixie finds out that she's pregnant. Is that the part that you wanted me to talk about a little bit, Dan?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Good. Okay. Yes. And so this, I believe, was probably unexpected, and apparently, according to Dixie, by all accounts, Scott was just furious, raving mad, stark mad, about this news, and just did not want to have this baby, and by all accounts, just becomes verbally abusive and apparently even physically abusive toward Dixie, just over this issue that she was going to go forward and have this child. She was adamant; she absolutely wanted to have the child, and by her account, and we have nothing to believe that it's not true, just based on Scott's character and other issues. That he absolutely did not want to go forward and have this child, and that is going to become kind of a key wedge or a key issue, that's really going to strain the relationship. On top of the fact that the financial situation for Dixie and Scott and their family is really starting to put them in a perilous predicament. Comes around the summer months of 2002. Right around this time that this news of this pregnancy, Dan.
Now, she's kind of isolated from her family, is she not? And at this time as well, she's not really confiding in her friends about how this relationship has, either improved or not improved when we're talking about Brenda Johnson. But tell us what she does say, though, in terms of the abuse extending to the baby, the claim about Scott.
Well, she's going to claim that Scott's going to eventually, punch her in the stomach and hit her, again yelling at her and screaming at her and just telling her that she's not going to have this baby. And do you want me just to keep going forward on that, Dan, and go into
Sure.
the day of this homicide? So again, according to Dixie's account, again, this would have been very late summer of 2002, but she had gotten one of her oldest children, Zach, got him up for school, and getting him ready to get on the school bus, and the story is that that the young boy, again about 7 or 8 years old, would have gone into the bedroom to say goodbye to his father, and Scott just kind of rolled over and continued to sleep. Dixie gets her son ready for school, and shortly thereafter Scott wakes up and just kind of a ball of fury and rage, I should say, and just angry about the kid going off to school, and then a fight develops again over this pregnancy, and from there the story is that a fight eventually moves into the garage, where Scott had beaten Dixie, had punched her repeatedly, and eventually gets moved back into the house, and and that's where Scott apparently grabs his shotgun, and kind of gives Dixie the evil eyes, and tells her, this day is not over with yet. Again, according to her account, he takes the shotgun, walks with it back into his bedroom, and Dixie maintains that this is the time that she's finally going to call law enforcement. And again, for context purposes for listeners, all the while that Dixie had returned to Defiance, Iowa, after the charges were dismissed against Scott back in the early part of 2001, there had never been one call to law enforcement for any domestic violence by Dixie. But we know that there was probably a lot of domestic abuse still going on. And like you pointed out, she was very isolated, unintentionally or intentionally, as far as just her small support network really was not aware, that things were escalating and becoming worse for her. But on this occasion, according to Dixie, she maintains that she made the decision she was going to go back in that bedroom and use the telephone. And I forgot to point out for listeners, but earlier when Scott had walked up to her and scowled at her about the shotgun and said this day isn't over, according to Dixie, Scott had also grabbed a couple of the telephones. People mostly had landlines at that point in time, really didn't have cell phones as much. So the story is Scott grabbed the cell phone or grabbed the landlines, took them back to the bedroom with him along with the shotgun. And Dixie's going to maintain that she walked down the hallway, went into the bedroom to use the phone, saw the shotgun by the bed, and thought that Scott was, going to shoot her, and that she grabbed the gun and, in a moment of heroic self-defense, shot Scott in fear of her life and thinking about her unborn child. And just after that, retreated back to the living room and just sat in the living room chair, for several hours, and just kind of thought to herself, oh my God, what just happened? Just kind of this whole set of events just kind of really hit home. Again, that's Dixie's account of how the morning went, and how things escalated and turned not only violent but fatal. Dan.
What does she say that she does with Scott's body and the room that he is killed in? What does she do, according to her?
Well, she's going to maintain that she's going to go into that room, I think, once or twice that day, and that's pretty much going to be it. But what she's going to do was after she shot him, she's going to pull the bed sheets just over his head, and so basically you can't see his face, and there's just a lump under the bed at that point in time. So she's going to cover him up in their bedroom, in the northeast bedroom of the house of the ranch, and then there's also going to be kind of a chest of drawers that, again, there's two doors that lead to the bedroom. One, being the main door from the hallway, the main hallway in the home. But then there's also a second door from the bathroom right over by the bedroom. And there's going to be a chest of drawers that's going to be placed, or a hamper, I should say, placed up against the bathroom door. So in effect, somebody, if anybody was using the bathroom and tried to open the door and go into the bathroom or go into the bedroom, they would be blocked. It just would be next to impossible, unless you're a pro football player, to get in there. And the other things that she's going to do too, Dan, is she's going to put down some towels underneath the door, kind of that half-inch area, on both doors. But she's going to put some towels down there to basically prevent any odors or stench from percolating into the house. And along those lines too, I should point out, but I almost forgot about the windows. But the window in the back bedroom, she's going to crank that open, and that's going to be open up pretty much all summer, fall, and winter. Over the next 6 to 9 months. The back bedroom door is going to be open. Bedroom window, I should say, is going to be wide open. And so she takes these steps, and not only that, then she's eventually going to move a bunch of boxes, cardboard boxes, and some of these I think came from Christmas gifts that she had bought her children, for different toys, and I think a TV and a stereo possibly. But anyway, there's going to be a bunch of children's toys, and I think a cooler, but just all kinds of stuff's going to kind of block the door, the main, door for the northeast bedroom that she and Scott had previously shared. But that's pretty much it. Once she closes that door, she closes that chapter, of her life as far as just, Scott's just remains under the covers to his dead body, hour after hour, day after day, over the course of many, many months. And it's going to take a while. Yeah.
Let's go back now, because part of it is that we don't get all this information at the same time. So, unbeknownst to anyone, Scott Shanahan, his parents are dead. He's not really much of a lot of friends or co-workers that he's had in Harlan or in the small town of Defiance. So he's not reported missing. But what people in this small community notice is that they don't see him in town. They see Dixie in town. Tell us some of the suspicious things that kind of stack up for people that can't help but observing things in this small town.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, that's a good point to bring up. So again, in a small town like Defiance, Iowa, everybody kind of knows everybody. But on the other side too, I want to point out, people aren't always overly nosy, and people do keep to themselves. But the thing is, Dixie's going to take a handful of actions that people are going to kind of raise their eyebrow and become a little suspicious of, just because they're going to know it's not in Scott's character. And some of those things that she does immediately in the aftermath of his death are selling off, putting ads in newspapers, including the Omaha newspaper, 60 miles away. But she's going to put classified ads in the paper to sell off some of Scott's prized possessions, including a number of these cars and I can't say this, and antique tractors that he had also collected or had on his property, and a bunch of his tools. Now, some of the people that are going to come to take a look at these vehicles are going to be people that are already familiar a little bit with Scott Shanahan, to the point where, they're even going to be very reluctant because they know Scott's reputation, and his explosive tendencies. They're going to become a little reluctant, and they tell Dixie that, when Scott comes back, when they see Scott, they'll just bring him back the vehicle and stuff. And I should point out, Dixie would tell these people that Scott had run off. There were different stories that she gave, but it was kind of all along the lines of that he had run away. One story had him going to a town about 50 or 60 miles away, Atlantic, Iowa. Other stories had him in different parts of Iowa. But the story was that he had up and left her and the kids. And again, along those lines, some of these people were very reluctant to even want to take his vehicles, thinking he'd be back. But I know in one situation in particular where Dixie made a comment over at the post office to a fella, where, again, she was willing to let him take one of the farm tractors for nothing, and he was willing to just to put it on his lot, and the minute he saw Scott return to town, Scott could just gladly come by and take the tractor back, no problems. And Dixie makes a comment, just very bold, he's not coming back. And again, at that point in time, the guy wasn't thinking, oh my God, he's probably dead, he's murdered in the back bedroom. But as time goes by and the events unfold, and nobody sees Scott, it's those kinds of comments that people are going to remember. And again, there was another fellow that lived over in Council Bluffs, Iowa, which is very close to Omaha, and he's going to become interested in the classic cars. And he just remembers when he made the phone call to inquire about the car, just that, Dixie was selling these classic cars, but really didn't sound like she knew practically anything, about the vehicles and stuff like that. So he was worried that he was walking into the middle of a potential divorce or jealous situation or a property being repossessed, and just was very reluctant to, want to even go up there to Defiance Hour look at these cars. But eventually he's going to make the drive up there with his kid, and they're going to buy one of the cars and some tools for $700 or $800. But again, it's other people kind of become suspicious of a lot of this stuff too, because they just knew Scott real well, and they knew about the only thing Scott loved in life, or seemed to love in life, was his tools and these cars that he spent all his time refurbishing and restoring. And for his wife Dixie to be just pawning, pawning's not the right word, but just to be selling these off one at a time, for some extra money, if Scott supposedly is still around, just did not make very much sense at all to these people. And the most important thing too that seemed to get overlooked, but Scott's truck was still sitting in his driveway the whole time too. So it begged the question, if Scott did run off, how did he run off? How did he get out of Defiance, Iowa, if his truck was still, his brown truck was still sitting in his blacktop driveway on Third Avenue?
Now, to add to the another incredulous, person that should be have some red flags when he talks to Dixie is Jeff Duty. And so tell us who Jeff Duty is and what his relationship becomes with Dixie.
Yeah, so Jeff Duty's, he's a few years older than Dixie, memory serves, and he lived in a town about half an hour to 45 minutes away called Ida Grove, Iowa, and he had worked at one of the big manufacturing companies in Ida Grove. But it's around the Memorial Day weekend of 2003 where Jeff and Dixie become acquainted with each other at a local neighborhood barbecue that was hosted by one of the other neighbors of Dixie and Scott Shanahan. Their last name was the Carls. But anyway, Dixie and Jeff Duty hit it off right away, and to the point where they become a very serious couple, and serious item, from the outset. And Jeff would stay at Dixie's house on the weekends, pretty much every weekend during the summer of 2003. And I know they go on at least one vacation together too, as well. But again, he's staying at the Shanahan home on 3rd Avenue, and I don't know how to explain this other than he just overlooked or was not inquisitive. Didn't ask the right questions, didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. But he's staying at the Shanahan house. Meanwhile, Dixie's main bedroom, the master bedroom, is cordoned off, and they're spending their time sleeping on a bed in a back bedroom, off the kitchen, if I'm not mistaken. I can't remember if it's a real bedroom or it's kind of a pull-up bed, but nonetheless, they're not sleeping in the master bedroom. And his version, his statement later is, that he just suspected or was under the impression that that's where all the abuse had happened, and more or less he took Dixie at her word that that's why the room was closed, and he respected her privacy and respected her wishes, and never was curious and never tried to open the door, and certainly, according to him, never suspected that Scott Shanahan was dead, rotting away in that under the covers of that back bedroom. It's a peculiar situation, to say the least, but there really was never any evidence, or certainly no proof, that somehow he was in on this situation, that he had any knowledge or intimate knowledge or any knowledge at all, that Scott's body was being concealed in that back northeast bedroom of the house. And again, the other thing too, though, and again, when you brought up that point earlier, Dan, about people becoming suspicious in town about Dixie's actions, I think the fact that she was dating Jeff Duty, bringing him to the house, to the Shanahan house, and he was staying there every weekend, and people saw his vehicle in that driveway all the time, that, in a lot of respects, was a huge red flag for some of the folks in the real small town of Defiance, Iowa, too, Dan, because people just knew Scott Shanahan so well that they couldn't imagine that somehow he would put up with, his wife carrying on an affair, letting some other man stay at his house all this while and stuff like that. So the fact that she's dating Jeff Duty after selling off a lot of Scott's tools and his vehicles for extra money, and the fact that nobody saw Scott around town, that's ultimately going to at least push somebody in the community to make a phone call to the Shelby County Sheriff's Office over in Harlan, Iowa, 12 miles away, sometime during the summer months of 2003.
Now you introduce a character named Gene Cavanaugh, and he has some questions, and so he looks at what the official reports were and initial statements. And so tell us how he proceeds with this, and what does he do to basically reopen this case?
Yeah, Gene's an old school sheriff too, and just kind of back in the day, where, he's not really a political grandstander. He's an old-fashioned detective, and in this case, the call comes to him, and he kind of takes the initiative too to not only assign one of his deputies to do some work, but then Gene's going to also do some of the key investigative work himself. Bottom line, he's going to send somebody out to at least ask Dixie basically what's up, where's Scott at? They've gotten a call that, people haven't seen Scott in town for practically a full year now. And, again, her story is that Scott ran off and, may have gone to Atlantic, Iowa. What Gene's going to eventually do, though, is he's going to do some legwork and background research, too. He's going to start getting a hold of some of the other area law enforcement departments, try to find out if Scott had moved to any of these area towns. He's also going to check and see if any of those area towns had any law enforcement contact with him. Had he been stopped for a traffic offense or arrested for anything? Nobody's going to find anything there. He's going to do a lot more research than that, too. He's going to see if Scott may have moved to a different state. Are there any driver's license records for Scott? The only one that came up was the one he already had, a state of Iowa driver's license. Gene's going to eventually check payroll records and unemployment records, through different federal databases. Is Scott receiving unemployment somewhere? Did he find a job somewhere? That's not going to lead anywhere. There's no proof. There's no indication that Scott's collecting any unemployment or working in a job where he's, paying taxes either. And there's other steps that Gene's going to take too. But the long and short of it is that Gene Cavanaugh is not going to find any paper trail that's going to lead him to believe that that there's any activity going on with Scott Shanahan, including his bank account, any credit cards, nothing like that. And that's again going to lead Gene, and his deputies to continue to interview Dixie to try to get to the bottom of things. And her story's going to deviate a little bit. Over time to the point where it's going to be different versions of the story, and there's going to be a story she's going to throw out there, about Scott had, found another girlfriend, some heavy-set blonde woman that may have come by to pick him up and then dropped him off one time to pick up some of his music CDs. But by and large, from Gene Cavanaugh's standpoint, he had exhausted all the legitimate leads, that Scott may have been a missing person voluntarily, that Scott may have left his wife, and decided to take on, move away and start a new life somewhere else for other reasons. And really the only thing left really for the sheriff's office to do was to check the property to see if by chance Scott Shanahan was still there. And I remember Sheriff Cavanaugh told me, and I may have put this in the book, I can't remember if I did or not, but I know he did not think that they were going to find anything when they went ahead with the search warrant. He just wasn't expecting to find, what they ultimately found that first, actually it was around October 20th of 2003, Dan.
Now, right away, she's at a friend's house, but we'll just skip over that. She is arrested, and she is charged. So tell us what the charges are, what the bail is set at, and how things proceed just right initially after she is arrested.
Dixie is arrested and charged with first-degree murder, and the bail, if memory serves, I think was around $100,000, but it was 10% then. So, and the town's going to rally to her defense too, to the point where they're going to take up some goodwill offerings and collection buckets at the local tavern and stuff like that. But she's going to bail out of jail shortly after being arrested and charged with Scott's murder. And again, just based on what the sheriff's office in the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation, which again is the equivalent of the state detectives agency, to help out smaller departments if necessary. The Shelby County Sheriff's Office worked hand in hand with them to help carry out the search warrant that found Scott. But again, it's based on the autopsy and based on what they found in the bedroom that left the authorities very convinced, that Scott Shanahan died, from an intentional homicide, and that this was not some type of domestic spat, where it was a case of self-defense.
Now the thing is to dispute the claim of self-defense. Initially, what you have is the autopsy. So tell us where he was shot in terms of, and her, we went over the explanation that she again gives, there's a trial, but let's talk about what the autopsy gleaned in terms of how he was shot and where he was shot in that room. So, and then tell us just what she had initially said in her statement as to how she feared for her life, and it was self-defense. Tell us again about what her statement was.
Right. Well, getting back to the autopsy, Dan. When they take Scott's remains, and there wasn't much left of him. He was down to about 40 to 45 pounds, but there was still a fair amount of flesh there. And when they took him to the autopsy table and turned him over, they found that there was a shotgun shell lodged in the back of his skull, and so nothing in the front. And ordinarily, obviously, listeners would know this, but in a self-defense situation, just think of whether it's a gunfight or just a knifing situation, but the expectation would be that the person would be wounded, or hurt, on their face, on their skin, not on their backside, and that's true in this situation. So you have Scott suffering one fatal shotgun blast, and it's to the back of his head. And it's also important to point out, too, that since his body was left in the exact condition that it appeared he was shot in, Scott appeared to be resting comfortably, sleeping, no less, at the time that he was shot. He had a pillow. He had his head on a pillow. He had apparently he slept with a pillow between his legs. Prosecutor pointed out that that's not that uncommon. But he was wearing his boxer shorts. So the inference to law enforcement and to the crime scene officials, was that, and again, pointing out the fact that the only wound, the mortal wound, was to the back of his head. Was that Scott had been shot from the back, from behind. Somebody basically had sneaked up on him, and shot him from behind and shot him in his sleep. And so, again, the physical evidence in the crime scene indicated that this was a homicide where the person was may have been shot while they were sleeping, and that it was not a case, or at least the evidence didn't show that this was a case of self-defense. And again, backing up to earlier part of the interview, Dixie's version of events, her story was that, that she had gone to that back bedroom to try to retrieve one of her telephones. She was going to call the sheriff's office that morning once and for all, fed up with the abuse that she was enduring through Scott, especially related to this third pregnancy that she had experienced. And that she saw that there was a gun near the bed between Scott and the dresser, and she thought that Scott was in the process of lunging for this shotgun of his, and that she thought to herself that she needed to protect herself and her unborn child. So she quickly grabbed the gun and fired a shot aimlessly. And it happened to hit Scott in the back of his head, and that was the catastrophic version of events that had happened that day, according to her statement, I should say, Dan.
Now she gets a public defender, but she gets two public defenders, and these guys are not rookies. These guys are experienced. There is
Correct.
An incredible amount of public support for her and in the community, and also, and there's also a big sentiment against Scott Shanahan. There's this acknowledgement that he was a bad guy and maybe had it coming to him. Now, in light of that sentiment, and of course that sentiment can lead to a jury having those kinds of feeling as well in a community like this, there was a plea bargain, again a little bit surprising, that was offered through to the attorneys. And as we all know, not taking the advice of your attorneys usually doesn't work out well to your advantage. So what was the plea bargain for, and why was the plea bargain offered, do you think?
Well, the plea bargain, just to answer your question, Dan, the plea bargain was to the charge of manslaughter. and it would have carried a maximum penalty, maximum sentence of 0 to 10 years. And in Iowa, oftentimes, if you got the 10-year maximum, you would probably be released from custody after serving 5 to 7 years, and maybe even shorter than that. It really would depend on the defendant's behavior and how they were adapting to prison life, and so on and so forth. So bottom line, if Dixie would have accepted this plea bargain, she would have probably been released from custody, after serving 5 to 7 years. And again, the plea bargain was unusual one, according to my conversations and interviews with the key prosecutor in this case, Charlie Feldman, who was from the Iowa Attorney General's office, and he was kind of the lone wolf on this case because, again, small town situation where you get there's very few lawyers and everybody kind of knows everybody, but lawyers have to be careful of conflicts of interest. The recently elected prosecutor, Marcus Gross, had previously served as a public defender for Scott Shanahan on one of those earlier domestic violence cases that he had pleaded guilty to. So Marcus had informed the court that it was in his best interest and that of the community at large that he bow out of the case and not be involved. So that's how Charlie Feldman from Sioux City, Iowa, got involved in the case and handled it himself. But Feldman, the prosecutor, had not initially offered Dixie a plea bargain, but he kind of felt prodded. Pressured would not be the right word. It wasn't pressured, but just kind of prodded by the judge, who was a interesting guy, a really likable guy named Charlie Smith, Judge Charles Smith. And just Smith had kind of indicated that he'd like to at least see a plea bargain offered in this case, and Feldman interpreted that to mean that the judge wanted to see the case resolved with a plea bargain, and probably 90 to 98%, I should say probably 98% of all criminal cases do get resolved with a plea bargain and don't go to trial. So it was not that unexpected for a plea bargain to be offered. Anyway, Feldman goes ahead and it goes along with this program. He had visited with Sheriff Cavanaugh ahead of time, and also Mark Hervey, who was the chief deputy, and kind of told them what was up. They both were on board with the idea of a plea bargain, thinking that might be a fair way to resolve the case and just get it resolved. So Feldman goes ahead and makes this offer, and he never hears back from the main attorney for Dixie, Greg Stensland. A day passes, another day passes. I think by the third day, Feldman's starting to scratch his head. So he places a phone call, gets a hold of Greg Stensland, and Greg informs him that that his client, does not want to accept any plea bargain, and again I should point out, Feldman was the one that Greg Stensland, Dixie's attorney, was the first one that had made the comment early on in the case, saying that he thought she would be more than willing to plea bargain down to manslaughter, but in reality, by the time push came to shove, Dixie was adamantly refused to accept a plea bargain. So everything was kind of off at that point in time, and she was going to go to trial on this murder charge, and that's kind of the stage that was set. And you're right, she knew what she already had. There was a lot of public support for her. I mean, people in the town and the area had a lot of them had given money to help her bail out of jail. As you pointed out earlier, Scott had very few friends. Of all murder victims that I could remember encountering in my last 20 years as a reporter in a handful of different states too, Dan, I just can't really, nobody else comes to mind of somebody that just really people by and large just did not miss. So he was an unsympathetic murder victim here. And ordinarily when you have high profile murder cases like this, as listeners know, you hear about pretrial publicity and it's usually the defense that wants to move the trial to a different county thinking they can't get a fair trial. Well, that's the opposite here. Dixie was more than willing to take her chances in her home county, Shelby County, Iowa, and and pick a jury, amongst her neighbors and and other people throughout the Shelby County area, thinking that they couldn't possibly find her guilty of murder, when the case went to trial. Dan.
Now, she doesn't listen to her attorneys, so the attorneys have this dilemma where they have an uncooperative client, unrealistic, so there's nothing else to lose, and since it's going to be he said, she said, and he being dead, then she has to take the stand. So we don't have much time, but we can't go through the entire trial. But really, tell us a little bit about the cross-examination and really where the prosecutor really decimated her on the stand with an issue that really she couldn't really answer and really spoke to her lack of credibility.
Well, and it really was a fascinating trial, but it really did boil down to what was Dixie, how was the jury going to view Dixie's testimony, because clearly she took the position of that this was a justification. She was justified in committing in fatally wounding her husband. We know, the listeners know her version of events. Thelman, in my mind, really reminds me a lot of a Clint Eastwood, as far as he's not a very loud or overbearing guy, although he is a big guy, Charlie Thelman, the prosecutor, but he's very subtle in his line of questioning, and he was very professional and very courteous to Dixie Shanahan on the stand. But it really worked to his advantage, where he was able to convince the 12 jurors that she had helped select that her version of events just could not jibe with the facts. And he hammered her over and over by pointing out the photos, and he showed the video of the crime scene, as far as just how Scott was still in that bed 14 months after she had shot him, and he looked like he was sleeping in that bed. And again, he really drove home the fact that her story just couldn't be true. That there's no way that she shot Scott with his own shotgun, during an argument or a struggle over the gun, when the wound was to the back of his head. And I'll point out real quickly one other thing that he had used that really was damning for her. Dixie did not know how to operate weapons. I mean, she testified that she was not familiar with shotguns.
Right.
This was, I believe, a 16-gauge shotgun, and the ammunition round that was used to kill Scott was a 12-gauge round. There was also a 20-gauge round that was jammed, that was stuck in the chamber, I believe, of the shotgun. And Thelman did a masterful job as far as showing the jury that Scott Shanahan may have done all kinds of bad things in life, but he knew his cars and he knew his weapons, and there was no rhyme or reason for Scott Shanahan to have the wrong ammunition in his own gun. So that spoke to premeditation, and Thelman was able to convince the jury that it was Dixie that loaded that shotgun, and she loaded it with the wrong ammunition because she didn't know the ammunition, and that's why Scott got shot with a 12-gauge round with a 16-gauge shotgun, and that's why the 20-gauge round was still stuck in the shotgun. So again, Thelman's just really able to hammer home to the jury a very simple point, that her version of events just absolutely can't be true, that she's not telling the truth on the witness stand. People may be sympathetic toward her. She may have been a multiple-time domestic violence victim. He didn't dispute that, and he stressed that. But his point was that didn't make it right. That didn't make it right for this to be an intentional homicide, and for Dixie to leave Scott's body in the bedroom, and not do anything about it, and let 14 months pass, while his body is just kind of rotting away in that back bedroom, Dan.
He also mentioned too that because the prosecutor reached out to her specifically to Dixie that she had more than ample opportunities to go to police when she was in Texas as well. He pointed out several things that she couldn't answer to in terms of opportunities to be able to end this, rather than what she claimed was this one and only opportunity. And because he lunged for her with the weapon, that she had no choice. Now, with this as well, this story doesn't end in terms of, with the trial, she's convicted of second-degree murder. Tell us about the sentence, and then, again, just to add to this story, the story doesn't end there. So tell us about the sentence, and then tell us what happens after that.
Well, this was a situation where, as you said, the jury is going to convict Dixie of second-degree murder. And in Iowa at that point in time, Iowa several years earlier had enacted these very tough, kind of get tough, no nonsense laws, trying to get tougher on crime and violent criminals, but not kind of allowing any mitigating factors to get work their way into the case, which certainly was true in this case. And so the judge was forced to give Dixie just a flat 50-year sentence. So Judge Charles Smith had no opportunity at all to give her a light sentence or even give her a stiffer sentence. And he certainly would have given her a lighter sentence, given all that she had been through in life and all the hardships and the abuse that she had gone through. But so the sentencing was horrible. I mean, I don't say horrible, but just it was a waste of time, and everybody in the courtroom pretty much admitted that, including the judge. So the judge really felt sorry for her, and he felt she did, deserve to go to prison. He felt the jury's verdict was just, and he informed everyone that he was not going to overturn the verdict. But he did not believe that the sentence was just, and he pointed out that he hoped, in the aftermath of Dixie's case, that the publicity about it and the high-profile nature of it would spark the state of Iowa legislature to reconsider its earlier decision to set these get-tough laws, where the judges had absolutely no leeway or wiggle room in determining a sentence. He had hoped that this case would spark some debate and foster debate and cause them to reconsider and make changes. But that never did happen. I mean, there was some debate, but politicians, Democrat and Republican, never came together and made any changes to the law. So she went to prison with the standard 50-year sentence. A few years after she was in prison, though, the Iowa governor at that point in time, before he left office to join the Barack Obama's cabinet as Secretary of Agriculture, but Tom Vilsack had commuted the bottom portion of her sentence. So he didn't commute her sentence, but basically what this meant was that earlier she would have been eligible for parole if she had served 35 years. Now he made it more or less that after she served 10 years in prison, she would become eligible for parole for release every year thereafter. So 2014 was the first year. So last summer was the first year that she was eligible for parole. And unfortunately for her, just based on her behavior in prison, she had still racked up a lot of violations for problems in behavior. And I think the fact that there had been some turnover too. The parole board is very political, and some of the people that were initially on the parole board, were gone, and by and large, this parole board from last year decided just flatly not to grant her parole. She just came up recently, Dan, and earlier this summer, and her bid was denied. But I want to point this out. This is important. But it sounds like she was ordered to undergo. They were going to have a psychologist do some evaluation, and so she's supposed to come back up. They basically said they'd reevaluate her case in a couple of months. So it'll be interesting. But by September, we should have word whether or not they're going to consider. Maybe letting her out early, maybe even this year. So she's been in prison now since 2004. So she's been in the state of Iowa's prison system for 11 years now. So it's possible now, that her days, are getting a lot closer to release, actually.
And what's interesting, sort of end note to this as well is that she stated in that parole bid that she did have prospects for work and she had a home to go back to and a community that was supportive.
Correct. And I even spoke with Sheriff Cavanaugh just a week or two ago because I'm going to be back in Harlan, Iowa. I think it's August 6th. I'm going to do 2 presentations back at the library there, and Gene and I were talking over the phone, and yeah, he agreed. He thinks that the day is coming that that she may get released, and he's repeatedly told me, he's like, John, she's going to go back to that house. My understanding is Jeff Duty, who she eventually did marry after she was charged with murder. But, my understanding is Jeff Duty is still living in that house, and by all indications, by all accounts, if Dixie gets released from Iowa prison, whether it's this year, next year, or whenever, but she'll return to Defiance, Iowa, and move back to that house. And I would expect that she would be welcomed, or at least accepted by the community. There's still a lot of people that feel that, that she served more than enough time now, 11 years, of prison, and I think a lot of people would be willing to accept her back into the Defiance, Iowa community, Dan.
Big question. What happened to her children? Where are they now?
Her children ultimately wound up with her with one of her sisters down in the state of Texas. Then, Dan. So they are. My understanding is that they're all still living down there. I think her oldest is 18 or 19 years old now, but yeah, my understanding is that they're continuing to live there, and I'm not exactly sure how much contact she can have with them, given the fact that she's in prison in Iowa and they're down in Texas. I know they still correspond, but again, shortly after she went to prison, her parental rights, were revoked, and her children were, placed in custody with other family members, and those family members happened to be in the state of Texas, and Dan.
Very interesting. I want to thank you very much for coming on and talking about Dixie's Last Stand. Was it murder or self-defense? Now, for those people that might want to find out more about some of the other true crime offerings that you have, I know you're with Wild Blue Press, but tell us about where they might locate you. Do you have a website? Do you do Facebook? Tell us how people might be able to contact you.
Yeah, I try to be very active on social media fronts, and John Ferak, so JOHNFERAK.com is my primary website, and keep that updated regularly. And then yes, I am an author, true crime author affiliated with Steve Jackson and the Wild Blue Press group, which has some excellent authors like Caitlin Rother and Ron Francel and Burl Bear and a few others, and like I said, so I have a page on the Wild Blue Press website as well, and my most recent book was just released last week, and that's actually a sequel to Bloody Lies, the CSI Scandal in the Heartland. So that book is called Body of Proof, Tainted Evidence in the Jessica O'Grady Murder, ? So it's hard to do radio interviews, but as far as just to say it that way, but I have to point out it's a question mark. So listeners will have to make up their minds after reading the book, whether or not there was evidence that was planted by this infamous CSI in Nebraska that worked on this very high-profile Omaha murder case that involved a beautiful young woman named Jessica O'Grady, who was involved in a relationship with a fellow her age named Christopher Edwards. So again, those are the primary spots, and people can also follow me on Facebook at True Crime Author John Ferak. Dan.
One last question, because I'm intrigued here, is that we did interview about Bloody Lies. And so you say this is a sequel, and I really have not heard that term in true crime. So tell us a little bit, just before we go, why it's a sequel.
Yeah. Well, the thing that's, and I didn't necessarily plan it out this way, but I kept this in the back of my mind. The last few pages of Bloody lies. I mentioned this murder case in Omaha, a very high-profile case that had actually happened just 3 weeks after the farmhouse murders in Murdoch, Nebraska, where the Stocks were killed, Dan, Jessica O'Grady murder. And I know I even included a photo of a car that suspected blood was found. But the thing about this case was that Dave Kofod becomes the hero. He becomes the key law enforcement official, the key testifier for the prosecution's case in what became Nebraska's first no-body murder case that went to trial. And the thing was that this case had happened 3 weeks after the Murdoch murders and also the Brendan Gonzalez murders. So Kofod goes to prison for planting evidence in those two prior cases. But yet questions remained and questions lingered in the wake of his conviction and sentence. Well, what about the Jessica O'Grady murder? Was the evidence, all this evidence that he found that helped secure the arrest and prosecution of Christopher Edwards, was it legitimate or not? And that's pretty much the whole point of, the key point of my book, Dan, is to really dive into that evidence and also, take a deep look at this case and put it in context.
Well, it sounds great. Sounds like an opportunity for me to interview you again about that. So that will be another interesting interview, no doubt. So I want to thank you very much for coming on and talking about Dixie's Last Stand. You have a great evening and hope to talk to you again real soon. Thank you.
Great. Thanks again for the opportunity, Dan. Have a great night.
You too. Good night.
Good night.